Taiwan Today with Natalie So.
Hello and welcome to Taiwan Today. I'm Natalie So. Today I speak with Nick Coburn-Palo, an expert on negotiation and leadership. He taught at the United Nations Institute of Training and Research, UNITAR, and is now teaching at the Taipei American School. I asked Nick first what he thinks are the most important qualities of a leader.
Well, that's an incredibly hard question, and it's situationally different because you take a classically great leader like Winston Churchill, and his ability to inspire and motivate the British people during World War II was one of the keys to the British holding on through the Battle of Britain and afterwards to ultimately prevail in the war. But after the war, he tried to be a prime minister in a non-wartime setting and was an absolute failure, most would say. Churchill had great leadership skills as a wartime military leader that he lacked as a peacetime domestic policy leader. So it depends on the specific context, and it depends on the time. Genghis Khan was a great leader and a great wartime leader, but if you drop Genghis Khan into the world of cyber warfare, he's used to fighting on horseback with a spear. So his whole style is going to be caught. But I actually asked this question when I was in Italy last year. I was brought out by European House Ambassetti to work with a group of business executives. And at the luncheon, I asked them, now that I'm done talking, I want to ask you a question. What do you think the most important traits of young leaders rising in your businesses throughout Europe are? And the two most consistent answers I got rang true for me: empathy and preparation.
Wow.
Yep, the ability to think beyond yourself and think from the perspective of others, whether it's coworkers, clients, or opponents, and to basically stop being so selfish and self-interested in terms of how you're interacting as a leader, and to be perceived that way is really important. And preparation. And Abraham Lincoln's a great example of this. He went through numerous failures in the early part of his life. He failed time and time again, but he always told himself, be ready, and someday my opportunity will come. And when it did come, he was able to grasp it and become one of our greatest presidents. So doing the preparation work. Sometimes if you're not ready to embrace an opportunity, it'll pass by and you'll never even know it was there. So that preparation for a leader is not only important in terms of an outcome, but part of being a great leader is being perceived as a great leader. You're trying to command a group of people. If you look unprepared, if you look uncaring about other people, who will follow you and support you? This is a problem that, quite frankly, our American president, Donald Trump, is having right now, because notoriously about him, his greatest loyalty is to himself and his family. So a lot of his campaign advisors, with investigations going on, are asking themselves, should I keep following this person? And in this case, he has an empathy deficit toward them, that whether it's there or not, they're perceiving it as being there, and it's causing him problems.
Wow, I didn't even think about these two, empathy and preparedness. So it's not a natural, like what people would think, charisma or speaking skills or anything like that.
That's a particular leadership style. And in the same way with comedy, not everyone should try the same type of comedy. If you have a dry sense of humor, you should not try a bombastic stand-up style a la Jim Carrey or someone like that. As a leader, there are different types of leaders. There are people who lead by example, who lead quietly, who build respect slowly over time. And then there are those loud, brash leaders, and not every leadership style works as well in the same setting. And not everyone needs to be a leader in the classic sense, because we live in a world where there are a lot of alphas out there. Everyone wants to be the alpha, to be a leader, to be perceived that way. The people who become the indispensable players are those mixing personalities, the ones who are largely egoless, who can find a way to connect those alphas and get them to work together. Every great scorer on a basketball team needs a point guard to pass them the ball. Every great spiker on a volleyball court needs someone to set for them. And in that way, I think we have to expand our notion of leadership, that the leader is not always the one at the front giving the speech. Oftentimes, the leader can be the one sitting quietly in the eaves who signed off on the speech, who got the speaker ready. And that's a different way of thinking about leadership. I think a very helpful one. Now, certain types of leadership, military leadership, for example, require a certain amount of charisma. It's very rare you see a great military leader completely bereft of charisma. But that's not always true. Look at the great leaders in labs in the electronics sector, for example. They don't need megawatt personalities. Not everyone has to be Elon Musk. Okay, there are lots of other leadership models you can follow. Steve Wozniak, for example, is a great example of someone who, he was not Steve Jobs, he was not bombastic, but people were incredibly loyal to Steve Wozniak. And even when they left Steve Jobs, when Apple didn't go well, they still followed the Woz because he had empathy and he was always prepared.
So that's a credibility too, right?
I think so. I think it's a very underestimated one. We think of leaders as strong-willed, charismatic, and a little bit selfish. And that is one form of leadership. It's not necessarily the only one or the best one.
So when you were working with high school students here in Taipei, how do you inspire them to become better leaders?
Well, I teach at a school, Taipei American School, that has a great student leadership program focused on wellness and focused on a series of guiding value principles. So I teach within that framework, but I'm also really lucky to teach an honors seminar that I've taught for several years now called Crisis in Leadership. And it's a year-long class where we study some of the great leaders in history, people like Cyrus the Great, Napoleon, Churchill. We study leaders from this region, East Asia, who faced a great moment of crisis in the not too distant past. People like Lee Kuan Yew, Park Chung-hee, and go back and look at the big nexus point decisions they had to make and re-examine how they did that. And then we engage extensively in simulation learning. And I'm a big believer in simulation learning. So we'll do role plays, very extended role plays, some of them highly quantitative. For example, we have the students replicate the North Korean nuclear talks with teams of students taking on different positions and having to negotiate a full-on agreement in live time with different variables coming their way. For crisis management, we have students pretend they're the head of a major airline. The rest of the class are the press corps after a major accident has happened. How do you balance what the crisis manager says, take responsibility, reach out to the victims, with what the lawyers say, admit nothing, don't get sued? How do you thread that needle? And we teach those broad skills to the students. But we also try and get a lot smaller because great leadership for those students is occurring in their clubs, or it's occurring with their brothers and sisters, or it's occurring in their neighborhoods. And we try and draw out how those same skills really are ultimately interconnected. And a lot of those skills are involved in reading people and seeing them as they need to be seen and learning how to lead with respect. Things that aren't just true in leadership, they're true in negotiation. They all tap into what I would call EQ. And I think that is the one raw skill right now that students are lacking everywhere.
So that I totally agree, because it's not on the syllabus. It's not something that maybe parents even know how to teach their kids, right? Or especially in Asia, the focus is on grades. How do you help people's students EQ?
I think it's a question of recognition and then treating it with the same seriousness that we treat everything else, understanding how important it really is. Students are growing up right now in the most data-rich time in the history of the world. Data is everywhere, and their ability to communicate with each other has never been better. People have a handheld device almost everywhere that allows instantaneous contact, and yet face-to-face communication skills have never been more poorly developed, I don't think. So what we try to do in that regard is emphasize the importance of it. As I say to the students, you might in your robotics lab come up with $1 million idea, but if you can't explain that $1 million idea to someone, it's never going to go into production. You're never going to see any benefits from it. So you need to be motivated to learn this and treat it with the same seriousness that you do memorizing a fact pattern, getting ready for a test, getting an internship. Join clubs and organizations, do things that force you to develop that skill set. Whether it's a church group, whether it's a local community charitable group, whether it's a sports team, you've got to get your head out of the laptop and be around people and understand how interesting they are. Learn not just how to read a fact pattern, learn how to read a person, their body language, the tone of voice, everything they bring to the table.
So you teach them how to read a person?
Yes, we do.
How do you teach them?
Well, happily, there's no shortage of resources out there on body language. And the key thing with body language is there's a lot of people who claim to be lie spotters, and there's a certain element of that. But there's no one magic bullet for knowing when someone's lying. What you train people to do is look for a series of patterns that are happening physically all at the same time that will lead you toward a certain tendency. Nervousness, excitement, something like that, that then in the context of everything else might tell you something else. So you're looking for things, is someone, if someone is just like sort of scratching their head or their shoulder, they might just have an itch that day. On the other hand, they might be really nervous. So if you see a cluster of nervousness. That tells you there's some apprehension, whether they're unhappy talking about it, whether they're being untruthful. If you want that conversation to succeed, you're going to have to make them more comfortable. You need to throw them soft questions, easy questions, to bring them back into the fold at that point.
So really being aware, I think, of the other person in a holistic way, right?
So often, and I'm guilty of this sometimes, we all are, we're listening to someone talk, but we're really waiting for our turn to talk. We're on hold.
Right.
We're not really hearing them. We're trying to hold our thought in our head. It's a terrible habit. And people feel disrespected, not empowered on one end when they catch you doing that. You're missing a chance to alter your rhetoric and adjust what you're saying in a way that will reach them differently. If you want to be a leader, the feeling that you respect the people who are following you is absolutely essential to inculcate. No one wants to feel like they're being played like a chump, that they're not being respected, that they're just being used. They have to feel empowered and part of the process. And leaders who neglect EQ to come up with the great battle plan or the great business strategy have only done half the work.
And what do you notice about the culture here in Taiwan in terms of leadership? Are any particular strengths and weaknesses that you've noticed in the culture here?
Yeah, I think that loyalty is incredibly strong here. It's not always assumed to be so in a lot of Western societies. People are considered to be more transactional, to be more about individual self-interest. Here, loyalty is a card you play, and dignity is a card you play. I was very struck by something when I first moved here. I saw a bus pull up on my street, and someone had not been picked up. And so the person ran to the door and pounded on the door. All the people around the bus stop. Now, in the United States, they would have broken out their cameras. They would have wanted pictures. People would be like, fight, fight, yelling, all excited about it. Here, everyone went silent and backed away. That person had lost control of their emotions. They had lost their composure. They had lost their dignity, and everyone felt bad for them. It's such a different way of approaching how leaders and people who are respected should act. In America, anger is a signifier for righteousness and truth, and you believe what you're saying. It's not that people in Asia don't get angry. Of course they get angry, but they display their anger in a different way, and it's considered a weakness to go over the top, except on very rare occasions.
So it's a very different culture you're dealing with, right?
It absolutely is, I think, in terms of leadership styles. If you walk in, if you're from Texas, and I talked about this in my TED Talk, if you're from Texas and you show up in Beijing and you're a younger person, you meet an older businessman, you want to do business with them, and you put your Texas death grip handshake on them and call them by their first name and look them directly in the eye, you're making a big mistake. That relationship is not going to work. And so you really can't just do what you want to do as a leader. You have to ask what the best connection and fit's going to be. I feel like people in Asia do that very well. I feel like oftentimes Westerners are so obtuse they miss the subtlety of what's happening there, but the signaling is there for those who want to see it. Now, a great example is when Hillary Clinton, early in her term as Secretary of State, her first big trip to Asia, she showed up and immediately wanted to engage the Chinese on the question of what to do after President Kim died in North Korea. And so she began with death. This was a terrible, terrible strategic decision. Why would you do that? You didn't think about the culture you were walking into. So even the best of diplomats run afoul of that kind of thing.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you think of our mayor, Taipei mayor? He's known for saying the wrong thing, but he still has his own kind of charisma.
He does, and I'm sure his political handlers would like to rein him in. And I wouldn't take the comparison with Trump too far, but sometimes people's followers like them to say things that are a little over the edge, things that they want to say they feel like aren't being said, or they're being genuine. And if he can cultivate that feeling of genuineness, I'm not polished or varnished, I call it like I see it, that can tap into a populist impulse that can be effective. If, on the other hand, he's perceived as making unforced error after unforced error, that charm won't last very long.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nick, for all your insights into leadership. It's been a joy talking with you.
Great to talk to you, Natalie. Thank you.
That is Nick Coburn-Palo, an expert on negotiation and leadership. He has a TED Talk called Why Negotiations Fail and is now a teacher at the Taipei American School. Thanks for tuning in to Taiwan Today. I'm Natalie So.
You're listening.
You're listening to Radio Taiwan International
From Taipei, Taiwan.